Good evening, everybody. Thank you for being here tonight with us. I'm Peter Steeves, and it's my privilege to be the director of the DePaul Humanities Center. And on behalf of myself and our distinguished panel of speakers, I want to welcome you to our next event in our year-long series, Discards, the Futures of the Book and Library. We're here this evening to talk about books that are not meant to be read. Banned, burned, censored, otherwise erased, or never even brought into existence in the first place. The books we're considering tonight are books that are almost non-books. Books that exhibit a kind of writing that sits in a strange space between published and unpublished, libraries and oblivion. It's not exactly freedom of speech or freedom of the press that we wish to investigate, though such notions will surely come up for us. Rather, it's what it means to be a book and to be a reader when a book, any book, is kept from its potential audience. Unfortunately, we have a long history from which to draw sordid examples. And this evening, you'll hear from an interdisciplinary group of scholars and artists who will, no doubt, help us think about those examples and what they mean for us today with great skill and creativity. In the foyer, you'll find for purchase some of the books written by our panelists, and I encourage you to pick up a book or two or three if you haven't done so already. They are archives of some great history, scholarship, and art. And up here on stage, you'll see books of a different stripe in our makeshift banned book bonfire. We've added copies of books to this fire that will, I think, all be discussed one way or another tonight, at least peripherally. And we hope that you'll support the creativity and scholarship of our speakers by purchasing their work outside, but also, in the spirit of celebrating the book, once this evening is over, I'd like to invite everyone in the audience to come up to the stage and take one of the books out of the bonfire for free. So please help yourself just to one copy per person, but come up when the evening is finished and take one of these banned books home with you, rescuing it from the paper flames as our gift to you. We've got about 50 books up here, so hopefully there'll be enough for everyone. I will introduce each of our speakers, rather, individually before bringing them to the stage. And tonight promises to be an exciting and eclectic start to an important conversation. But before we officially get underway, I thought we might take a moment to think about what it means to hope that someone else doesn't read something, and then to use one's power, whatever that power may be, to make that a reality. So let me suggest then 4 quick examples which might serve as sort of touchstones for our time together. Our intellectual tradition begins arguably with Socrates and the Greek thinkers in the West who took up his legacy. And this much is clear. Socrates wanted to keep you from reading his work. Not that he censored or burned papyri, but that he never wrote anything down to be read in the first place, because he mistrusted the written word. His was not only an oral tradition, but an oral tradition that took up the question of writing and roundly rejected it. Here, then, is our first example, the sentiment expressed in the Phaedrus, written by Socrates' student Plato, that suggests that the invention of writing is a curse, and writing should never be taught to humans. Plato writes, "If men learn writing, it will implant forgetfulness in their souls. They'll cease to exercise memory because they rely on that which is written, calling things to remembrance no longer from within themselves, but by means of external marks. What you have discovered is a recipe not for memory, but for reminder. And it's no true wisdom that you offer your disciples, but only its semblance. For by telling them of many things without teaching them, you will make them seem to know much, while for the most part they know nothing. And as men filled not with wisdom, but with the conceit of wisdom, they will be a burden to their fellows." Reading something that has been written down, that is, will make the reader think he or she knows and understands. And book-smart people quickly become bores and burdens. Of course, we know that Socrates believed all of this because his pupil Plato wrote it down. So we have a strange occurrence here of someone writing about how horrible writing is. The text, in essence, is condemning itself, if we're to take it at face value. But taking a text at face value is never a good idea. perhaps this can be the first page of our cautionary tale this evening. Example number 2. The great library of Alexandria was burned at least 4 times. 3 of these were related to acts of war, including Julius Caesar's civil war in 48 BCE. But one is attributed to an intentional act of vandalism. A decree of Emperor Theodosius in 391 AD outlawed paganism and thus all non-Christian texts. Most of the Library of Alexandria was put to the flames on the order of the emperor. Pagan art and writing would lead people away from true belief, was the thought, and so such things were forbidden for the good of the souls of all Romans. And we know this because Socrates of Constantinople wrote about it in volume 5 of his book, Historica Ecclesiastica, 50 years later. For our third example, consider the letter that Franz Kafka wrote in 1924 to his friend Max Brod, a letter found on Kafka's desk in Prague soon after Kafka died at the age of 41. Dearest Max, read the letter, my last request, everything I leave behind me in the way of diaries, manuscripts, letters, my own and others, sketches, and so on, all is to be burned unread. Kafka himself estimated that he had burned more than 90% of everything that he had ever previously written, and so it was little surprise that his dying wish was to have the final 10% kept from the world as well. Brod, of course, betrayed Kafka's wishes. This is why the world was able to read such things as The Trial 1 year later. And this is why Brod famously stuffed the rest of Kafka's writings into a suitcase in 1939, hopping the final train from Prague just 5 minutes before the Nazis shut down the Czechoslovakian border. A few years later, the Nazis would indeed destroy copies of Kafka's work in their book bonfires, strangely fulfilling the letter, if not the spirit, of Kafka's own final request. Finally, and a bit more abstractly, consider the mechanisms of capitalism that have been responsible for people never reading books. The mechanism, that is, that drives all of our culture, profit motive. There are countless books that are never printed because someone thinks they won't make money for those who own the means of production. We seldom call this a form of censorship, but this is in fact what such an economic system creates. And I'm not speaking here of the thoughtful editors who curate a press, trying to choose with some sort of ideal in mind. I mean only to remind us that even the greatest work of writing today might not get read unless someone thinks it could make a buck. Now, I've called these 4 examples to mind to begin our evening together because it seems to me that they raise questions about the different ways in which a page might be made forbidden and thus never come to be read. Socrates and Theodosius, for better or worse, both wanted to care for the souls of their countrymen. Kafka's intentions were no doubt far more complicated, though apparently directed inward toward himself and less about the well-being of potential readers. Freud, another author tossed into the Nazi bonfires, would no doubt help us understand Kafka a bit better. And then Random House, Pearson, Kluver, McGraw-Hill, HarperCollins? Their lack of commitment to the good of the public is easy to see in the very corporate structure. In each of these 4 cases, however, there is an ideology at work, a commitment to something other than the book itself, other than the writing one wishes to prevent, burn, or erase. In each case, there is the hope that what the book means might be dealt with by merely focusing on the book itself. Kill the book, and you accomplish some other final goal. For the capitalist, the unpublished book leads to more money. For Kafka, like an anxious animal hiding in his burrow even after death, it leads to security. For the Alexandria arsonist, it leads to souls spared from hell. To Socrates, it leads to wisdom. All of these things can be accomplished if language only refers, denotes, and pictures. If books only represent, stand in for, and mean something other than themselves. But what if this is not the case at all? What if language makes the things themselves present to consciousness, and books mean themselves? Of course, books come to meaning hermeneutically, which is to say that they have meaning because they fall into a landscape of meaning created by other books and other readings and other readers that are already there historically. But this does not point us away from the book. It instead points us to a community of books and a community of readers inflating the book to life. The French philosopher Jacques Derrida understood that writing for Socrates was both the poison and the cure, with the ambiguity being right there in the Greek word pharmakon. And he knew, too, that both speech and writing are brought to life by repetition, and thus they always defer meaning as much as they bring it to light. Perhaps, too, there are subtle deconstructions to be had elsewhere in the history of forbidden pages. Perhaps Kafka's writing to his friend with the request to burn all his writing is, in fact, a request that destroys itself, since this letter, too, and all that it instructs one to do, would be cast to the flames, thus, perhaps, saving the rest of the writing. Here, in both of these instances of books not yet published, there's something that spurs us on toward publication. And if we lament the burning of Alexandria, perhaps it's only because we distrust the emperor, the particular man who is said to be caring for us, caring for our souls, not because we think we should always read everything, no matter how much it might harm us. It's true that our libertarian culture might make us think that we should be free to read it all, that you should be free to read every horrible thing posted about you online, every nasty tweet or YouTube comment some troll has come up with, every poem by an ex-boyfriend or girlfriend that eviscerates your heart, every book that slanders you and cares little for the truth or your well-being in any way. But a good editor, like a good archivist, a good librarian, a good caretaker, always does make choices. Some things stay and others go. And perhaps the key is to have a community committed to justice and our common good more than to some abstract negative right of freedom of speech even. Perhaps, that is, there's some hope of defending Socrates, Theodosius, and Kafka if placed into another context. But we're left finally with that fourth example. Searching for a way to find in the capitalist and the publisher some heroic motive that saves him, some way in which some good might come from profit-driven censorship. And it's here, in conclusion, that I must admit that I'm stuck, wordless. Perhaps it's true that when you burn a book, you burn the world. You burn the things themselves. But when you keep a book from being written, you also keep the world from coming into being. The imperialist and the capitalist give rise to a shiny world of gold, but potentially a world without any words in it at all. And so we might be reminded that book burning and forbidding of reading is not merely something that some other has done. It's not merely a problem for ISIS, or the Nazis, or the Soviets, or the McCarthyites of America's 1950s. Political ideology, as we'll see tonight, has led to arrests, exiles, banishments, and bonfires. But it's always good to remember the mote in one's own ocular ideology before seeing the speck in the eye of the other. Here, to help us see clearly and to think clearly, are three exceptional artists and scholars, and it's my honor to introduce them to you tonight. We begin with Professor Wiegand Nickell from the Department of Slavic Language and Literatures at the University of Chicago. Professor Nickell is widely considered to be one of the nation's top experts on modern Russian culture and the work of Tolstoy. His book, The Death of Tolstoy, from Cornell University Press, won an MLA award and was received with popular and critical acclaim when it was published in 2010. It is indeed a splendid piece of writing that's both scholarly and accessible, making the events surrounding the passing of Tolstoy come alive for us today. Professor Nickell is also well known for his innovative pedagogy and his methods of making history and ideas come to life, having at one point recreated a Soviet apartment in which his students lived for a full semester, authentic down to the food on the shelves, the furniture in the rooms, and the books there or not there in the dorm library. A careful scholar, creative thinker, here with his talk entitled Censoring Subjects, I'm pleased to introduce to you Professor Wiegand Nickell.
Thank you, Peter. It was actually a full year I had to live there. So. Well, I want to begin with a drink of water, and then by saying something that I probably shouldn't say here, but I think I'm going to. Well, what I wanted to say was that a sense of prohibition energizes words. If you got a little nervous and attentive during that pause, that's the very sort of energy that I want to think about. And it's a kind of perverse way maybe to begin the night, because I'm going to talk about the way Aesopian language actually creates a productive literary atmosphere in a strange way. So, I'll start with actually this slide, which you can see is an X-ray, but it's actually a phonograph record that was printed on an X-ray of the St. Louis Blues. This was one of the ways that people who didn't have access to Western music figured out to reproduce the recordings they loved and circulate them in the Soviet Union in the 1960s. The next slide is actually a pretty odd little episode in the history of Soviet censorship. I will give you the text in English here. The State Scientific Publishing House, Great Soviet Encyclopedia, recommends that you remove from volume 5 of the Great Soviet Encyclopedia pages 21, 22, 23, and 24, as well as the portrait inserted between pages 22 and 23, and replacement for which have been sent pages with a new text. The designated pages can be cut out with scissors or a razor blade, inserting the inner edge, preserving the inner edge to which the new pages can be attached. This is just a really odd thing, isn't it? Just imagine that you're subscribing to this encyclopedia, you've received these volumes and put them on your shelf, and then suddenly you're asked to cut out some of the pages and replace them with others. The offending pages contained a portrait of Lavrenti Beria, who had recently been deposed from his position at the head of the Soviet secret police, and he was one of the key figures in the government at the time of Stalin's death, but he had been arrested and executed. And the text describing his work for the Soviet Union was no longer deemed necessary or even desirable in the Great Soviet Encyclopedia. In their place, subscribers received this page, photographs of the Bering Sea, and a new entry on Friedrich Wilhelm von Bergholz, a relatively obscure visitor to Russia who left some memoirs of his time there in the early 18th century. So this odd transposition of a politically charged text with these images of the Bering Sea, I think is an interesting way of thinking about the problem that we're concerned with tonight, that once we prohibit one text, we end up putting something else there in its place. And the Bering Sea somehow suddenly becomes more, it gets elevated to this perhaps undeserved position. I took the title for this evening's event quite literally. And I'm going to offer some other examples in which it's not books that are banned, but literally pages that are banned. So the next one we're going to look at, I actually have this one here with me. This is a very well-known volume called The Canal, named after Stalin, the Stalin Canal. This was kind of a coffee table book in the 1930s, if you can imagine. It described how prison laborers were being reformed through being forced to dig out this canal. Many people perished in this enterprise, and a group of writers were sent to describe this process. This was seen as a way in which the Soviet Union was changing people's lives in this dramatic fashion, producing new Soviet subjects from former criminals. And I was pretty happy when I found this book in Moscow a number of years ago, and I took it home. And I hadn't really looked that closely, and what I found as I looked was that it was actually missing some pages. So I'm just going to go through this. This is Wiegand, who was also involved with the secret police. And this is from a copy that's in the library at the University of Chicago. And here you can see my copy. That portrait is missing. Here you can see, I don't know if you probably can't read, but I'll tell you, we go from page 50 to 53, and maybe you can see that there are pages torn out there. Here we go from 200 to 213. Here, you can see the orange there. Someone actually cut out an individual name of a person who had been identified as an enemy of the people. There you can see the full text. And then I discovered that there are actually other differences, that there are evidently 2 editions of the text in which there had been some changes made in the printing. So this person was the secret police at the Canal Project. He evidently had also been purged. So his picture disappeared. Now, in our culture, we maintain an ideal of the author and reader as solitary agents engaged in some sort of unimpeded communication. But what we see here is an entirely different process in which Soviet citizens are actually engaged with the government in this process of revising books even after they've been published, purging them of elements that are no longer desirable. Perhaps a way to think about the way we like to imagine literature working is to cite Virginia Woolf. She describes an author achieving or enjoying freedom of expression in the fullest sense. She writes, "The reason we know so little of Shakespeare compared with Donne or Ben Jonson or Milton is that his grudges and spites and antipathies are hidden from us. We're not held up by some revelation which reminds us of the writer. All desire to protest, to preach, to proclaim an injury, to pay off a score, to make the world the witness of some hardship or grievance was fired out of him and consumed. Therefore, his poetry flows from him free and unimpeded. If ever a human being got his work expressed completely, it was Shakespeare." The ideal of the writer, enjoying creative autonomy in her own space, both physical and psychological, was alien to the new mentality forged in the Soviet Union. Literature was a public domain, with public authorities who were attempting to shape and respond to collective consciousness. Zhanov, who was an important intellectual in the party, said at the 1934 Writers' Congress, "Our Soviet literature is not afraid of being called tendentious, because it is tendentious. In the age of class struggle, a non-class, non-tendentious, apolitical literature does not and cannot exist." Elsewhere, he argued that the Soviets had the right to teach morality to the world by virtue of their own unparalleled moral development. The Soviets actually inherited a long tradition of this sort of intervention in public literature. I have another example to show you here. And this is actually one of the books that are over here. I wanted to mention that these books that are available for you to take at the end of the talks are actually many classics of Soviet literature. This is one of the paradoxes of the literature. There's Dr. Zhivago there, Zamyatin's We, Solzhenitsyn's work. Another classic example from the 19th century is Tolstoy's Kreutzer Sonata, which was banned in Russia and around the world. It was banned in the United States. And what I have here is another find from a Moscow bookshop. This is a mimeographed, homemade copy of this text when it was not available in the bookstores. We don't think of this tradition of samizdat, as it was called, self-publishing, having been started in the 19th century, but in fact it was. show you what the text looks like. You can tell it is not printed in very high quality, but as I pointed out, there's still a certain devotion to the text, attested to by this portrait of Tolstoy in the front. This, though it was banned, enjoyed a huge success. And I'm kind of returning now to this point of the prohibited word being an energized word. Not only in Russia, but around the world, this became one of the most sought texts and most widely discussed texts. And people in Russia arranged readings. They would get together and copy the text out. One person would take a few pages and go off, and they would break the text into parts, and they would have these copying parties. And this was the same sort of thing that went on in the Soviet Union. There's this kind of return to almost an oral transmission. And this brings us to something that I always remember when I think about this problem. Osip Mandelstam, one of the great poets of the 20th century, who died in the purges in the 1930s, said to his wife one day when she was complaining about his persecution, he says, "Why are you complaining? Only in our country is poetry respected. Here they kill people for it." This is Mandelstam's mugshot from his first arrest in 1934, when he had composed an epigram denouncing Stalin and recited it aloud to about 10 people. One of them informed to the secret police, and he was arrested. This happens to be, I think, my favorite photograph of Mandelstam. Just, he looks so proud and defiant here. And he really, I think, is probably the one heroic figure of this period who really stood up for his rights as an author and for literature. But we see by the time of his next arrest in 1937, he looks quite different here. He was going to die a short time after these photographs were taken. So we have this odd record of Mandelstam in the KGB archives. This is the first written copy of the Stalin epigram was found in the KGB archives that they had recorded in their interrogation of Mandelstam. And we have many other somewhat strange testimonies to this culture from the 1930s. And this has been, I'm going to show you some photographs now from David King's book, The Commissar Vanishes. This first one reminds of one of the methods that was used in the imperial period to censor text from abroad that had passages that were considered censorable. They would just smear ink over them. They called it caviar. And here we can see actually the famous photographer Rodchenko doing this to one of his photographs of an important party figure who was purged. And as we go through these slides, we're going to see some other cases of doctoring of photographs. So Chapayev, a famous kind of folk hero, commander in the army, just watch these figures change. You can see in the smaller photo the original, and they have just gone and done the equivalent, the sort of earliest versions of Photoshop. They've removed this figure's face and replaced it with another. Here's another person who's been defaced. Stalin with Kamenev and others. We see Kamenev disappear and some people from the periphery disappear. Trotsky next to Lenin. Of course, we all know what happened to Trotsky. Another Trotsky image, and Bukharin. I'm sorry, Kamenev again. Sorry, it's Kamenev. Here's Trotsky in the back of a car riding with Sergei Orджonikidze. This is an interesting one. We just move that fellow over so that we can no longer see Trotsky. A rather famous image of Stalin walking with Manenkov and Yezhov, the head of the secret police. Notice the heads of secret police do not fare well in our story. First, Yezhov disappears. I'm sorry, I'm thinking of a different image. So watch the person in the back here. Go on. Here we go. Antipov, Stalin, Sergei Kirov, and Nikolai Shvernik. Minus Antipov, arrested in 1941 and shot. Minus Shvernik, we don't know what happened to him. Kirov was supposedly assassinated by Stalin himself, although this is still somewhat of a mystery. So finally we end with this image of simply Stalin by himself. As we can imagine, we extend this logic forward. We know what happened to Stalin. I'm going to show you a bit of video. This kind of censorship in its many media representations here. This is at the time of Stalin's funeral, the speech at the mausoleum, and you can see that they have engraved Stalin's name below Lenin's there. I'm going to start a video, and you'll see just a bit of this. And then it's going to be followed by some video of edits that were done to a film about Lenin, which featured Stalin prominently figuring him as Lenin's successor. So what you're going to get in the next clips are some shots from the original film followed by the edits that were done. So Lenin leaving the scene of an important speech that he gave, followed directly by Stalin. In this case, they simply cut that scene short. Well, no, I'm sorry, the person steps up. It's this one where they just cut it short. Now watch, here they come in. You can see in the original, there's Stalin, following directly behind Lenin. And here, this person suddenly appears to block our view. But if you watch very carefully, you'll see Stalin. Oh, why did he do that? And there we go. I'm going to stop it right there. So I assume that you're kind of amused by these. I mean, there's something engaging about them. The beauty of this film is that the state interference is represented by the standing soldier, the citizen in uniform, mobilized to obscure Stalin's respect for Lenin. The censoring authorities often appear to be oafish and out of place in our narrative. They stand, they sit, demand silence when they need to listen. Our eyes scan through the censored subject, find it by reading between the lines. The text becomes a site of contested close readings by the censor on one hand and by the subversive reader on the other. And this is one of the paradoxes of the history of Soviet literature. Literature was laden with risk, and these higher stakes produced more intensively engaged readers. The author becomes suggestive at times rather than expository, and the text itself is energized, its veiled messages almost completely hidden, appearing so furtively that the censor has missed them. Literature under censorship becomes an elaborate courtship, the teasing of truth and beauty, their wink suggesting a future but now impossible liaison, but also providing fleeting fulfillment in the powerful aesthetic experience of discerning a cunning evasion of authority. And in the Soviet Union, I think one of the things that I always emphasize when I teach this material is just this massive culture of prohibition creates just this vast realm of energized speech. There were so many things that weren't allowed that you could write about almost anything in this Aesopian way. So in conclusion, I want to I've kind of painted a somewhat romantic, perhaps, view of this environment, and I want to challenge that now. I mean, for one thing, we always need to remember that the system of censorship violently silenced many writers. Isaac Bobby was another writer, just a brilliant writer, who was arrested and executed in the 1930s. And during his trial, he said, "I consider my arrest the result of a fateful coincidence of my own inability to write. During the last few years, I have not published a single major work, and this might be considered sabotage and an unwillingness to write under Soviet conditions." Other writers who survived, like Pasternak, who's Dr. Zhivago is over here, commented that while Mayakovsky, they turned to translation, and Pasternak said about this, while Mayakovsky shot himself, I translate. This was a way of writing safe material. There's a long, dark period in Soviet literature in which we still cannot find any novels today that seem worthy of reading. I think they may be there, but we just don't seem to be able to find them. Next to these victims of the authors stand others, the readers, in their way of reading, which can be problematic even within the Aesopian tradition we've been admiring. The attention that comes with prohibition can lend a certain presumptive value to censored texts and produce reductive dialectics. A Soviet dissident described his experience as a child reading the excise passage on Beria in the Great Soviet Encyclopedia. His parents had left it in place, and he found himself turning to it repeatedly in his youth, finding pleasure in this illicit reading. He had become fascinated by the most banal sort of official Soviet biography. I have a Bulgarian friend who's a brilliant linguist, but when we get together, he always just wants to talk about Uriah Heep and Deep Purple. He's like the Jack Black of the character in School of Rock, for whom the defiant gesture of giving the finger to the man is always profound. The equation, exclusion from public discourse equals exclusive value, reminds us of other equations that Peter Vail has said describe the mythologies through which Soviet intellectuals rationalize their privations. The worse the system, the better the people. Or, if there's no sausage, there is spirituality. But I want to close by thinking about this problem of this distortion of the literary market in this way, and the result that what we end up with is a kind of sausagey spirituality. I remember when I was traveling in the Soviet Union in the late 1980s, and I was able to go into one of the Beryozka stores, which were set aside for, they were just open to foreigners, and they had things there that Soviet citizens couldn't buy. And some of these, they had a book section there that had books that just weren't in the stores. And I bought a copy, a 2-volume edition of Svetaeva for our guide, and I brought it out to her, and she just began weeping. And I was really moved by this, but I've often wondered since, was this feeling the result of her appreciation for a great work of literature, or for the receiving of a rare commodity? She was, in a way, still a product of the Soviet system, even as she subverted it. In the 1980s, shortly before the demise of the Soviet Union, an official at the state publishing house said, of course, we could make at least 5 million rubles by publishing a translation of The Godfather or a James Bond novel, but we refuse. And that is why we think our system is better than yours. And this strange mentality that there's just a kind of sort of gross class of things that are being censored. I think was also attested to just when I traveled just in the final days of the Soviet Union in Moscow, and I saw in this street kiosk they were selling pornography next to Bibles, images of the Madonna next to images of Madonna. They were kind of all the same in that environment. So I've been just trying to make 3 points here, that censorship energizes the word, that the Soviets created an extensive environment of energized words, but that also this environment is deeply problematic. And to take one last, perhaps somewhat enigmatic approach to that question, I'll conclude with a quote from Fazil Iskander, from his book, Sandro of Chegam. And a little context for it. In the height of the Soviet terror in 1937, Alexander Fadeev, who was later head of the Soviet Writers' Union, warned of enemies among the ranks who were masked and deceived their comrades. Extreme vigilance was necessary, he urged, for it was difficult to tell the bad from the good. Iskander describes Sandro of Chegam being called to perform with a group of Abkhazian dancers for Stalin, and he has to go through security. And he stands there as the woman looks at his ID and scrutinizes his face, and this is what he writes. The woman looked at his passport, checked it against some sort of list, then glanced critically at Uncle Sandro several times, trying to detect alien features in his face. Every time she looked at him, Uncle Sandro froze, trying not to let any alien features materialize, setting his face in an expression of nonchalant likeness to himself. I just love that. I think that's brilliant. And I think that we all hope for a world in which literature doesn't face this sort of scrutiny and lets all its alien and brilliant features appear on its face. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bill. So much to think about. What we're going to do is we'll have all the speakers come individually, and at the very end, we'll have a few minutes, and we'll be able to bring everybody up and have some Q&A with you guys. So, Matthew Girson is Associate Professor of Art, Media, and Design here at DePaul University. His recent show at the Chicago Cultural Center was entitled The Painter's Other Library, and is impressively one of more than a dozen solo exhibitions to his name. Returning the Cultural Center, which used to be Chicago's public library years ago, to its roots, Professor Girson hung canvases with dark, velvety, barely visible paintings of shelves of books and heavy curtains with only a hint of light, though, to the keen eye, multicolored specks of stars were splattered everywhere across the fabric of the pages. In the front room, thick, oil-slick black paintings of fire were installed in a line, all leading to a video installation of a black and white film-looped Nazi book bonfire. To spin one's head in the room was to see the individual painted canvases turned into frames of the movie, the books crackling due to the movement of the viewer, our own complicity in this history made apparent. It was as if the Cultural Center had been turned into one hexagonal room in a dark wing of Jorge Luis Borges' Library of Babel. And all of this is just a taste of merely the latest example of innovative work that has now spanned decades. With this talk, entitled Missing Voices, I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Matthew Girson.
Forbidden pages are documents rendered inaccessible for political reasons. My presentation will address another aspect of inaccessible texts that grow out of politics and move toward the artistic. I will start with a discussion of Nazi book burning and some general information about the Holocaust. I present this information to serve as a backdrop for my presentation, knowing that these subjects demand much greater time and attention. Forgive me if I don't go deep enough into the history, but I want to save some time for the literary, philosophical, and artistic examples at the end. Each literary and philosophical example relates to different ways that Nazism affected, compromised, or completely silenced voices after the war. The artworks I discuss give visual material form to missing voices and books, either directly or indirectly. On January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany by President Paul von Hindenburg. Less than 3 months after Hitler was appointed, book burnings were scheduled at universities across Germany by the main office of press and propaganda of the German Student Union. Un-German books chosen for burning were defined by the 12 Theses, a decree that articulated the difference between German literature that reflected the values of the folk and the un-German Jewish literature that undermined the German spirit. The introduction to the 12 Theses includes the following text, quote, "The Jewish mind, as it reveals itself in its unrestrained worldwide malicious agitation, and as it has already penetrated into the German literature, must be eradicated, together with all liberalism." On May 10, 1933, 25,000 volumes by over 100 authors deemed un-German were burned in public demonstrations throughout Germany. The authors whose works were burned had their volumes removed from libraries, they could no longer be published in Germany, and their work could not be included in school curricula. Authors were deemed un-German for their liberal views, whether they were Jewish or not, but the prominent thrust of Nazi ideology was built in and through their anti-Semitism. The assault against Germany's Jewish population was amplified in 1935 with the first of the Nuremberg Laws, formal restrictions designed to curtail the liberties and civil rights of Jews in Germany. On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland, beginning World War II. Among other motivations, Hitler and other Nazi leaders aspired to control Europe and rid the continent of its Jewish populations. On January 20th, 1942, the Wannsee Conference was convened by Adolf Eichmann on the orders of Lieutenant General Reinhard Heydrich. At this meeting, 15 high-ranking Nazi officials met to clarify, discuss, and coordinate the implementation of the final solution to the Jewish question, a euphemism for the mass extermination of European Jews. Heydrich's remarks include the following quotation, quote, "During the course of the final solution, the Jews will be deployed under the appropriate supervision at a suitable form of labor deployment in the East. In large labor columns separated by gender, able-bodied Jews will be brought to those regions to build roads, whereby a large number will doubtlessly be lost through natural reduction. Any final remnant that survives will doubtless consist of the elements most capable of resistance. They must be dealt with appropriately, since, representing the fruit of natural selection, they are to be regarded as the core of a new Jewish revival." From this point forward, the organized and systematic extermination of the Jews became high priority across Nazi-occupied Europe. Killing centers were upgraded, train routes were altered, and vast resources were applied to ensure the success of the final solution to the Jewish question. The largest of the killing centers was Auschwitz-Birkenau near Krakow, Poland. At its peak in 1943, approximately 6,000 people were being killed and cremated each day. The final solution continued unabated into 1944, even as the German military experienced losses on both the Eastern and Western fronts. On January 27, 1945, the death camp at Auschwitz-Birkenau was liberated by the Red Army. Other camps were liberated over the next few weeks and months as Nazi troops retreated and surrendered across occupied territory. On April 30th, 1945, Hitler committed suicide in his bunker, and on May 8th, Winston Churchill declared an end to the hostilities in Europe. As the war was ending, news about the concentration camps spread. It was soon learned that approximately 6 million Jews were killed by the Nazis and their Axis partners. In the years that followed, many survivors began sharing their experiences, and these first-person accounts remain central to how we understand the Holocaust. The various ways that people have responded include numerous texts that expound on events and explore themes related to Nazi crimes and their victims. These texts are voices present, but the absence of other voices is my point of departure. In part 2 of my presentation, I'll present some examples of missing voices. Each example is followed by works of art that give material form to the ideas discussed. Though the Holocaust is the focus of my research, and most of the artworks I present are related to Nazi crimes, not all artwork I present is based on these specific themes. Some works have been chosen because of how they engage missing voices from other conflicts. What all the works share is a sense of the absence felt in the wake of extreme political violence. After surviving the Holocaust, including a brief time at Auschwitz, Primo Levi returned to his native Italy and soon began writing poetry, memoirs, and short stories and essays. The quality of his writing and his voice as a survivor earned him accolades and fame, but this never sat comfortably within him. In Shame, the third chapter of his 1986 book, The Drowned and the Saved, he spoke about the uneasiness he felt for both surviving the Holocaust and for being recognized for giving voice to the horrors of the camp experience. And I'm going to have a little quotation here from chapter 3 of The Drowned and the Saved. Quote, "I must repeat, we, the survivors, are not the true witnesses. This is an uncomfortable notion of which I have become conscious little by little, reading the memoirs of others and reading mine at a distance of years. We survivors are not only an exiguous but also an anomalous minority. We are those who by their prevarications or abilities or good luck did not touch bottom." Close quote. Thus for Levy, the true victims of the Holocaust were the murdered victims who were denied opportunities to tell their own stories. In his writing, Levy was able to distinguish between the drowned and the saved, those who died at the hands of the Nazis and those who, like him, miraculously survived. But his position as a Jewish concentration camp survivor was an anomaly in Nazi-occupied Europe, not the rule. And I'll follow this with some examples from some recent artwork by Doris Salcedo. Doris Salcedo just opened an exhibit at the Museum of Contemporary Art on Chicago Avenue. I strongly recommend everybody go see this show. Doris Salcedo is Colombian. What she does is she takes objects from, very familiar objects from domestic time and space and life, furniture or pieces of clothing, and she renders them inaccessible or renders them unfamiliar by sort of merging them together, filling them with cement, making them obdurate, closing them off to our sort of regular domestic experience. These two photographs are actually photographs that I took this past, I guess, 9 days ago at the MCA, and I chose this particular work here. These are all untitled from 2007 because this one happens to be a bookshelf. I have a quote here from Doris Salcedo, which really sort of holds all this together. This is from a speech she gave a few years ago when she won a prize from the city of Hiroshima. Quote, "The epic mechanized scale of death that has characterized the 20th and 21st centuries has become systematically produced and thoroughly inscribed into our everyday lives. Art, on the other hand, can inscribe in our life a different kind of passage that is from suffering to signifying loss. I hope for my work to perform a role similar to that of a funeral oration." So she sees her work as sort of aiding in the mourning process. A lot of her work, and particularly these works, respond to the 60-year Civil War in Colombia. My next example is Martin Heidegger. Heidegger is included here to point out another silence vastly different from that of the silence described by Primo Levi. Heidegger is recognized as possibly the most influential philosopher of the 20th century and became a member of the Nazi Party in 1933. During the Nazi years and in the 31 years he lived after their fall, he never spoke out against the Nazi Party or its crimes. He did acknowledge them in a lecture on technology in 1949, 4 years after the war and the atrocities of the Holocaust had become international news. In this lecture, Heidegger likened agriculture and the mass food industry to the Nazi slaughter of the Jews. Quote, this is from the lecture in 1949. Quote, "Agriculture is now a motorized food industry, the same thing in its essence as the production of corpses in the gas chambers and the extermination camps, the same thing as blockades and the reduction of countries to famine, the same thing as the manufacture of the hydrogen bomb." Close quote. This is his only acknowledgement of the crimes of the Holocaust, but his language was far from critical. Themes from this lecture would later be published as the question concerning technology, but the reference to corpses, gas chambers, and famine would not be included in print. This section of the printed version reads as follows. Quote, "Agriculture is now the mechanized food industry. Air is now set upon to yield nitrogen, the earth to yield ore to yield uranium. For example, uranium is set upon to yield atomic energy, which can be released for either destructive or peaceful use." Close quote. Thus, the printed version makes reference to hydrogen bombs, but the subject of the Nazi mass extermination program and the gas chambers has been completely whitewashed. In 1966, Heidegger agreed to give an interview to the newspaper Der Spiegel on the condition that he edit it and that it not be published until after his death. 10 years later, on May 26, 1976, Martin Heidegger died. 5 days after that, Der Spiegel published the interview under the title, "Only a God Can Save Us." In the interview and in other material published after the war, Heidegger attempted to distance himself from Nazi ideology, but he never denounced Nazi policy, and he never once mentioned the Holocaust. This silence is an insult not only to the victims of Nazi terror, but to all other people and communities who were affected by Nazi policy and their crimes. In my attempt to render Heidegger's silence, I took 1 second of a Nazi bonfire from a Nazi propaganda film. I slowed it down and looped it over and over again, and I slowed it to different speeds. I then removed all of the audio and replaced it with audio of Martin Heidegger giving speeches and lectures. I then removed all of Heidegger's words, leaving only an occasional breath, the turning of the page, the sound of a turning of the page, or a cough. When he quotes other authors in the audio that I had, I left that in because those were other people's ideas. But what I'm really trying to do here is render Heidegger's silence. I'm going to play for you a 2-minute interval of this ongoing loop. At the beginning, we'll hear a quotation from Marx, and then the room is kind of loud. Hopefully, we'll be able to hear some of the breathing and page turning.
Die Philosophen haben die Welt nur verschieden interpretiert. Es kommt darauf an, sie zu verändern.
Oh, wrong one. What am I doing?
Die Philosophen haben die Welt nur verschieden interpretiert. Es kommt darauf an, sie zu verändern.
That quote was from Marx. It translates roughly as, "The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it." There's another quote in this video which is from Goethe, which is, "In normal life we make language work in a provisional way because we signify superficial relations. As soon as we speak of deeper relationships, there comes up suddenly another language, that of the poetical." My next example is Theodor Adorno. In 1949, German philosopher Theodor Adorno published Cultural Criticism and Society, in which he stated that, quote, To write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric, close quote. For Adorno, the barbarity of Auschwitz was antithetical to the creative expression of poetry. This, of course, did not stop poets from writing. Many poets recognized the significance of Adorno's statement and wrote through it. Their work recognizes the limits of their language to express how they lived through and what they believed after Auschwitz. In 1961, 12 years after Adorno's statement about poetry after Auschwitz, poet Hans Magnus Enzensberger discussed a collection of poems by Nelly Sachs called Journey into the Dustless Realm, and stated that the poetry of Sachs had disproved Adorno's harshest judgment. Adorno responded, "I would not want to modify the proposition that to go on writing lyric poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric. Through the aesthetic principle of stylization, an unimaginable fate still seems as if it has a meaning. It becomes transfigured. Something of the horror is removed," close quote. Excuse me. Okay. Thus, for Adorno, aesthetic stylization removed the horror from the subject of Auschwitz and thus compromised the depth and gravity of how we understood the Holocaust. 5 years later, in 1966, Adorno published Meditations on Metaphysics, which included the following quotation: "Perennial suffering has as much right to expression as a tortured man has to scream. Hence, it may have been wrong to say that after Auschwitz you could no longer write poems." I view the gap between Adorno's dismissal of poetry after Auschwitz in 1949 and his tentative acceptance of the need for poetic expression 17 years later as an interval rich with poetic resonance, if not also full of traumatic silence. For 17 years, the great philosopher of music and culture actually believed that Auschwitz mandated the silencing of poetic voices. During this interval in 1958, Holocaust survivor and poet Paul Celan used this language to discuss how Nazi crimes affected the voices of poets. Quote, "It, the language, remained not lost, yes, in spite of everything. But it had to pass through its own answerlessness, pass through frightful muting, pass through the thousand darknesses of death-bringing speech. It passed through and gave back no words for that which happened. Yet it passed through this happening, passed through and could come to light again, enriched by all this," close quote. Enriched is an odd word to describe poetic language when one considers the horrors experienced by Celan and millions of victims of Nazi crimes. Such experiences can hardly be considered enriching, but Celan fought against the grain of Adorno's 1949 mandate by writing poetry exclusively in German after the war. Celan translated into and out of 7 languages, but he chose to only write in German, even though that was not his first language, but he needed to write in German after the war. These poems, along with the poetry of Nelly Sachs and many others, make oblique references to Nazi crimes, but focus more on the limits of language in attempts to render its familiarity distant. Today, 70 years after the fall of the Nazis and almost 50 years since Adorno's acceptance of poetic expression after Auschwitz, it is fair to say that poetry and art have indeed been enriched by engaging survivor testimony and reflecting on the horror. Silence and missing voices have challenged poets and artists to operate in ways that are linguistically inventive, ethically sensitive, and aesthetically compelling. Silence has been made an explicit tenet for many post-war and postmodern artists. As the Holocaust continues to recede in time, and as we move through and past postmodernism, these tenets continue to inform the creative practice of artists and writers. I will close with examples from 2 contemporary sculptors whose works give form to the missing voices I have presented. The first example I have here is a sculpture by Rachel Whiteread, an English sculptor, and what she did here is she cast a bookshelf in plaster. So what we have here, the form that she presents, is the absence of books. She sort of made the space around them her material. The color that we see here, by the way, is the ink that was leached out of the book bindings during the casting process. More famously is her nameless library as a memorial to the mission Jews of Vienna. This is in Judenplatz, which is the historical center of Jewish culture in Vienna. Laser pointer. This here is yeshiva. It's a Jewish school, and there have been in the past many Jewish schools in and around this square and in this area, but there's not a whole lot of Jewish activity there now. What Rachel Whiteread has done is she's cast the interior of a library in solid cement, sort of made a negative form library. The walls are all cast cement books, and around the platform, around the perimeter, we have the names of the various camps where Jews from Vienna had been sent during the Holocaust. My next example is the library by Misha Ullmann in Bebelplatz in Berlin. This memorial is actually on the very same site where the Nazis had their book burnings in Berlin on May 10, 1933. We have an image of that here. Under the cobblestones, Misha Ullmann made an empty library that is accessible only from a 1 meter square of glass. It's illuminated from below, and when you come across it at nighttime, if you're walking down the street, there Unter der Linden, just east of the Brandenburg Gate, you just see a little bubble of light poking up from this vast, dark Platz. Here we can see the glass panel. The library inside is painted all white. It's large enough to hold 25,000 volumes, and again, that was the amount of books that had been burned by the Nazis on May 10th. Here's a drawing that Misha Ullmann made to give a sense of scale, to show how the illumination would have illuminated a viewer's legs from below. Here we have another view looking out across the street. That's Unter der Linden, and then that's Humboldt University across the street. And then right here we have a little bronze plaque which includes the quotation from Heinrich Heine where I started. That was just a prelude. Where they burn books, they will end also burn people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Those are really striking artistic and philosophical examples you've given us, and it was really nice to see your work there too. The breathing of Heidegger, wow, that was the room was just charged with silence there. So thank you for that. And well, if I could just share this quickly, while I was listening to that, some more than 20 years ago now, I wrote my dissertation in philosophy on Husserl, and Edmund Husserl was the teacher of Martin Heidegger. He was his dissertation director. And when Heidegger wrote his most famous book, Sein und Zeit, Being and Time, he dedicated it to his teacher, Husserl. And then after Heidegger joined the party, he had that page removed from the future editions of Being and Time, like with a razor blade. Thank you very much for that. There would be lots for us to talk about. We conclude this evening then with Professor Wayne A. Wiegand, who is F. William Summers Professor of Library and Information Studies Emeritus at Florida State University, and who is widely considered to be the United States' preeminent library historian. Professor Wiegand previously served as a professor in the School of Library and Information Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he was a founder and director of the Center for the History of Print Culture in Modern America. A 3-time winner of the G.K. Hall Award for Outstanding Contribution to Library Literature, Professor Wiegand is a member of the American Antiquarian Society and served as the organizer and director of the Florida Book Awards. He's received fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, New York Public Library, and several other organizations. And his list of publications is so long that were I to have printed out all of the titles, the paper would not serve as mere kindling, but could keep us warm all night if we had to light it up in a pinch. It's little wonder that he's often referred to as the Dean of American Library Historians. And there are 2 books of Professor Wiegand's that are special favorites of mine, both of which have particular meaning for us tonight. The first is a 2011 book from the University of Iowa Press entitled Main Street Public Library, Commune Places and Reading Spaces in the Rural Heartland, 1876 to 1956. Though the date of Professor Wiegand's historical analysis ends well before I was born, the patterns and policies he documents and so clearly interprets obviously continued on for decades more, as I felt as if he were describing my own boyhood experience at the one and only small public library in my hometown in rural Ohio. I learned from the first pages of Professor Wiegand's book that the United States has more public libraries than it has McDonald's restaurants. This gave me hope. And I went on to learn how libraries, like all institutions, are far from neutral, but instead have their own methods for creating, mediating, and maintaining local community values in a delicate balance of censorship, democracy, and power. This, too, gave me cautionary hope, if for no other reason than the fact that I always find truth hopeful. The second book I highlight, one co-authored with his wife Shirley on the topic of the Red Scare in the Heartland, bears the same title as tonight's talk, and it's thus that I'm indeed pleased to introduce to you, speaking on the topic of books on trial, Professor Wayne Wiegand.
I'm pleased to report to you that there are still more public libraries in the United States than McDonald's restaurants. Can't say the same thing about Subway, however. I'm honored to be here. Thank you for having me. I left these clients back in 2003, but I took with me 5 tweed jackets I collected over the course of the years, and I always welcome an opportunity to come back and wear one of the tweed jackets. Shortly after lunch on July 24, 1940, Oklahoma City Detective John Wade Webb took off his gun and street clothes, then put on an oil-stained shirt, an oil-soaked hat and overalls, and some greasy oil-soaked boots. He checked himself in the mirror, and because he deliberately had not shaved for 2 days, he judged himself to look like a communist. Without his gun, he then walked into 123 West Grand, descended to the second floor, and entered the Progressive Bookstore. There he encountered Bob Wood, store proprietor and secretary of the Oklahoma Communist Party. Thinking Webb an oil worker, Wood guided him to the trade union pamphlets. Webb demurred, however, and instead purchased copies of Lenin's State and Revolution, Stalin's Foundations of Leninism, and Marx's Communist Manifesto. When he returned to police headquarters, he turned the materials over to Captain Dan Hollingsworth, head of the Intelligence Division of the Oklahoma City Police. About noon on August 17th, Oklahoma City Police conducted a series of raids on the Progressive Bookstore, 5 private homes and the offices of the Communist Party. They arrested everyone in the homes and at the bookstore, customers and employees. Hours later, police returned to the bookstore and homes with liquor search warrants. Oklahoma was a dry state at the time and confiscated the entire contents of the bookstore and books, pamphlets, and other documents they found in private homes. To prevent friends and relatives from contacting those arrested, police booked more than 20 people under fictitious names, held them incommunicado for 3 days, and denied them legal counsel. Among those arrested was Robert and Ina Wood, Eli Jaffe, and Alan Shaw, all charged on August 20th with violating Oklahoma's criminal syndicalism law by being members of the Communist Party and for selling printed materials that advocated the violent overthrow of the government. Because the judge set bail for all 4 at $100,000, $50,000 for each charge, they remained in jail for months, where several were beaten by inmates, encouraged by jailers. I was supposed to start the thing. Here we go. Leading the prosecution was Assistant County Attorney John Eberly, a slight, imperious litigator who was fiercely anti-communist. To reporters at the time defendants were charged, he said, "It is the duty of every American to hate these communists. I say a jury ought to give them the maximum sentence of 10 years and a $5,000 fine. Then they can go back where they came from and tell the people who sent them, Oklahoma's too hot." Quick to come to the defense of those accused was the American Civil Liberties Union and the International Defense Fund, both headquartered in New York, both rumored to have ties to the Communist Party. Representing the defendants on behalf of the ACLU and the ILD were local attorneys George Kroon and Stanley Belden. Not until both filed complaints with the presiding judge did jailers allow defense lawyers to see their clients. At the arraignment, September 6, Belden moved to suppress the evidence Eberle had gathered, including the 10,000 books now stored in more than 40 boxes in a county jail cell. The evidence against these defendants is possession of books and pamphlets allegedly advocating the forcible overthrow of government, Belden said. He also implied the county prosecutor had political motivations in pushing the case. Eberle responded angrily by pounding so hard on the courtroom table he inadvertently broke the glass covering the top. Nobody knows their true names. Nobody knows where they're going, he argued. These are subversive people. The judge refused Belden's motion to suppress and allow the trials to proceed. The decision set in motion a series of events followed across the country for the next 3 years. Eventually, defendants drew support from First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, folk singers Pete Seeger and Woody Guthrie, whose Union Maid song was inspired by Ina Wood, members of the literary world like Dashiell Hammett, Richard Wright, and Theodore Dreiser, the nation's academic community, associations of librarians, social workers, and labor in the newspaper, periodical, and book publishing industries. In addition, thousands of ordinary citizens across the country wrote Oklahoma officials to protest the treatment accorded these defendants, whose only crime was owning and selling books that Oklahoma officials found objectionable. For the prosecution, principals involved included John Eberle, on the left here, son of a wealthy German Catholic immigrants who had been with the county attorney's office since 1932, and County Attorney Lewis Morris, thick-set, middle-aged legionnaire, good old boy, with ambitions for higher office. Both were graduates of the University of Oklahoma Law School. Defendants included Bob Wood, let me see if I can find this here. There's Bob Wood, Ina Wood, his wife, Alan Shaw, Eli Jaffe, and this is Wilma Jaffe, who was Eli eventually married, and she's still living in Oakland. Defendants included Bob Wood, a 34-year-old gregarious CPA member from Pennsylvania who had attended Harvard Law School and served on the defense team for the Scottsboro Boys in Alabama before being sent for his own safety to organize in Oklahoma in 1935. His wife, Ina, a private person born to poor Massachusetts Catholic parents and a graduate of the New England School of Law. Eli Jaffe, a slight but quick-tempered native of New York and recent graduate of Brooklyn College, known in metropolitan New York at the time as the Little Red Schoolhouse. He had relocated in the Sooner State to write a novel about poor people who lived there. And finally, Alan Shaw, a fellow graduate of Brooklyn College whose quiet, contemplative nature and propensity to muse about political ideology placed him in a sharp contrast to the other three. Initially defending them was George Kroon, a quiet-spoken but quick-witted lawyer from Tulsa, and Stanley Belden, a courageous defender of civil rights from Oklahoma's oil country, who had recently been jailed for refusing to kiss the flag to prove he was not a member of the Jehovah's Witnesses he was defending. All colorful personalities, all locked in a battle over civil liberties as the books were put on trial. First to be tried was Bob Wood. As the trial opened on October 1st, more than 40 cartons of material seized from the bookstore were trucked into the courtroom. While delivering his opening remarks, Eberle picked several titles from the boxes, including 3 purchased by Wade Webb several months earlier. We will merely read excerpts from these books, and that in itself will show violation of the law, he said. Eberle also promised to show that Wood was a member of the Communist Party and that he had guilty knowledge of the contents of the books he sold. Defense counsel objected. Materials obtained on August 17 had been seized in illegal raids, they argued. Only the items Webb purchased could be submitted into evidence. When the judge overruled them, defense lawyers argued that because they had not been given an inventory of the contents of the cartons, they couldn't properly prepare a defense. Again, the judge overruled them. With that, the pattern was set for all 4 cases. After closing arguments in which Eberle and Morris repeatedly referred to the Jewish profile of Communist Party membership and its position on equality for African Americans, On October 11, the jury delivered a verdict of guilty of breaking Oklahoma's criminal syndicalism law by selling books that recommended the violent overthrow of the government and recommended the maximum sentence of 10 years in prison and a $5,000 fine. Alice Shaw went on trial November 11 and was convicted December 10th. Eli Jaffe went on trial May 10th and was convicted May 22nd. Ina Wood went on trial June 11th and was convicted June 19th. In each case, the jury recommended the maximum sentence. In each case, the judge agreed with the jury. And in each case, the ACLU and the ILD filed appeals. Because the ILD also raised enough bail money to release all defendants between October and December 1940, defendants did not have to spend time in jail while their cases were being appealed. Sentenced to 10 years in prison and fined $5,000 for selling books, official Oklahoma did not like. That's the way a few inside and many outside the Sooner State read the decision. Oklahoma City's major dailies, the morning Daily Oklahoman and the afternoon Oklahoma City Times, both owned by the same person, supported the convictions. Most other newspapers in the state agreed, but evidence of dissatisfaction surfaced relatively quickly. The African-American Black Dispatch, edited by Roscoe Dungy out of Oklahoma City, was especially quick to report on and condemn the racist remarks Eberly and Morris laced throughout their arguments. In mid-October, several Oklahoma City clergy and University of Oklahoma faculty members organized themselves into the Oklahoma Federation for Constitutional Rights and protested the treatment and convictions suffered by the defendants. One OU student even made himself available to testify in Bob Wood's case that the same materials Wood was accused of selling were on the shelves of the OU library. The judge refused to let the student testify. Shortly thereafter, newspapers and periodicals outside the state began to notice the decisions. The Brooklyn College Vanguard urged students to contribute funds to the ACLU and ILD for Jaffe and Shaw's defense funds and encouraged them to write letters of protest to the Oklahoma County Attorney. A month later, Morris reported he had received a telegram signed by 6,000 students demanding he drop prosecutions of both Brooklyn College alumni. Communist publications like the Daily Worker and New Masses quickly condemned the convictions and followed the cases closely. In early November, however, liberal New York afternoon daily PM dispatched a correspondent to Oklahoma City to survey the situation and interview principal parties. When talking to the correspondent, Lewis Morris brought up the issue of race, and particularly a Communist Party pamphlet entitled Reds in Dixie. Suppose they go sell a lot of that book to a lot of the down-and-out no-goods we've got in this state raring for trouble. You'd see a race war around here about that time that'd make your hair stand on end. Ultimately, the correspondent concluded in his three-part article that official Oklahoma suffered from a collective paranoia that manifested itself in vigilantism. It is in such an atmosphere that Robert Wood and his fellow defendants must struggle to get criminal syndicalism in their cases rationally defined by courts and juries. The prognosis is not good. Under the heading, "We have our own Hitlers who would destroy civil liberties," the December 12th issue of the Capital Times of Madison, Wisconsin was even more vehement. Here we have an astonishing situation in which a man is given a prison term for selling books. In its December 28 issue, The Nation decried the vindictive sentences meted out to Wood and Shaw. It would be difficult to find a more flagrant example of judicial outrage of the Bill of Rights. In early January 1941, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch dispensed a correspondent to Oklahoma City to cover the activities of the Oklahoma Federation for Civil Liberties. Among the items he reported back to the paper was an account of Wood and Shaw trials in which he noted much of the evidence consisted of copious extracts from books and pamphlets, including standard works on economics to be found in all libraries. But the activities of official Oklahoma continued to keep the stories fresh. On their way back from New York for Ina's trial, Bob and Ina were arrested in Kansas City on April 24 before they were scheduled to give a speech to members of the local Human Rights Club. Chief of Police had them arrested, held them for 3 hours, then made them buy a one-way train ticket to Oklahoma City, where reporters took a picture of the couple disembarking from the train that ran on the front pages of newspapers across the nation. A month later, George Kroon was arrested in Bristow, Oklahoma by a state police on his way back from Tulsa for Ina's trial. Police said he was being held for possessing communist literature, which he had on the automobile seat next to him when he stopped by police. When his belongings, which included confidential materials he was using to defend Ina, were returned to him the next morning, he knew someone had gone through them. Left unchallenged, it would not take long for an American Gestapo to develop, commented the Duluth, Minnesota Herald. The old third degree was bad enough, but this sort of thing would leave few people safe from spite or plain viciousness, noted the Calumet, Michigan News Journal. Ina Wood's conviction, however, seemed to accelerate national attention to the book trial cases. In a June 20th, 1941 editorial entitled "A Woman of No Importance," the St. Louis Post-Dispatch asked, "For what was Mrs. Wood convicted? What she did was think thoughts, read books, and express ideas which the Ku Kluxers of Oklahoma did not like. What evidence did John Everly present to demonstrate her crime? Copious extracts from books and pamphlets seized from the Progressive Bookstore containing many works to be found in all libraries. If the FBI would raid the St. Louis Public Library, it could establish the same kind of case against the librarian and his staff." Next to the editorial, the newspaper carried a political cartoon showing the Statue of Liberty, but covering her torch was a cone labeled "Oklahoma Criminal Syndicalism Prosecutions." Like the photo of Ina and Bob Wood detraining in Oklahoma City, the cartoon circulated to and was reprinted by newspapers across the country. On June 28th, the Christian Science Monitor reprinted the editorial in its entirety. On June 22nd, more than 200 League of American Writers members signed a letter to Oklahoma Governor Leon Phillips and County Attorney Morris condemning the convictions as a most serious miscarriage of justice. Among the books held in a county jail and trotted out for each of the 4 trials in more than 40 boxes were John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, Richard Wright's Uncle Tom's Children, Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace, and the collected works of Jack London. If this conviction is upheld, the authors argued, the books now occupying a room in the county jail will be burned, for no longer needed as evidence, the county officials will destroy them. This will be the occasion for the first official book burning in our country. Signers included Franz Boas, Dashiell Hammett, Clifford Odets, Rockwell Kent, and Richard Wright. Between June 23 and 27, the American Newspaper Guild hosted its annual conference in Detroit. There, the membership passed a resolution that protested Oklahoma convictions of 4 people who faced lengthy prison terms and hefty fines for the mere possession of books and literature which are obtainable at virtually every public library. Shortly thereafter, editorials condemning the books appeared in Christian Century, New York Herald Tribune, Dayton Herald, the Greensboro, North Carolina Daily News, the Akron, Ohio Beacon Journal, and the Christian Evangelist. Even the Tulsa Tribune chimed in. We are in the middle of a growing season of screwballism. On July 5, Publishers Weekly told its readers why the book trials were important to books and booksellers. It first recounted the history of all 4 cases, noted support given to defendants by the ACLU, the ILD, the League of American Writers, and even Eleanor Roosevelt, who had contended everyone has a right to a defense. But for booksellers, the case had several alarming aspects. If the verdicts were not reversed, quote, a precedent in Oklahoma and perhaps elsewhere will be established for the seizure not only of controversial literature, but of other material on the same shelves, the arrest of bookshop customers present in the same shop with the material, and of booksellers offering it for sale. That was scary, PW concluded. The point at issue is not whether the books circulated exert a good or bad influence, but whether they, rather than overt acts of illegality, constitute evidence of conviction. In late August, Dartmouth College's assistant librarian, Alexander Lang, wrote to the lost my light, sorry. Alexander Lang, wrote to the Oklahoma Attorney General, "I should be glad if you would officially verify for our bibliographical use the authors in particular editions of books used as evidence in prosecuting persons connected with the Progressive Bookstore in Oklahoma City," he wrote. "It's already evident that this case will become a historic one in connection with the maintenance of free discussion in America, and we are consequently anxious to place on our open shelves for the students and for the public generally the authentic editions concerned while they are still readily available." The Attorney General immediately notified the local press that he was forwarding Lang's letter to Lewis Morris, but he told the Daily Oklahoman that inasmuch as Lang had that attitude, he was surprised he didn't have the books already. The Oklahoma City Times, which ran the story next to a picture of jailer John Moore sitting atop some of the 40 boxes of material seized in the August 17 raids, contacted Eberly for comment. Though the librarian, Eberly said, probably didn't know what he was doing, he'd be glad to send Dartmouth College a complete list of the books and authors. If Dartmouth wants them, Dartmouth can have them. I don't care who reads them in New Hampshire. I'm interested in their effect in Oklahoma. Shortly thereafter, one of the defense lawyers wrote Lang a note. Inasmuch as neither the defendants nor any of their attorneys have been able to secure an inventory of the property seized from the Oklahoma authorities, we would appreciate it very much if you would receive this, when you receive this list, if you would send us a copy. In its September 12 issue, PW Notice announced that the number of publishers and authors had crafted a statement to Governor Phillips protesting the convictions of the syndicalism defendants. It is our firm belief that such convictions, allowed to stand, such charges, allowed to be made, are a threat to our freedom to write, to publish, to sell books. Among those signing the statement were Alfred Harcourt of Harcourt Brace, Edward Mills of Longman's Green, Robert DeGraff of Pocketbooks, V.W. Hibsch of Viking Press, Paul Bradbury of Hastings House, John Barnes Pratt of A.S. Barnes and Company, Thayer Hoffman of Dial Press, Durant McCrae of McCrae Smith, Vernon Ives of Holiday House, and Robert McBride of McBride Publishing. Authors who attached their names to the statement included Aldous Huxley, Edgar Snow, and Carrie McWilliams. A number of authors and publishers, book, periodical, and newspaper, issued separate statements. Meyer Levin argued, "The dangerous and destructive revolutionists in this instance are the people who would cancel our basic liberties, and as book burners of Germany's cancel the liberties of that unhappy nation." Sterling North, literary editor for the Chicago Daily News, declared, "I am incensed and bewildered by the idiocy of the Oklahoma officials, who are imitating Hitler by burning books and persecuting booksellers. Official degeneracy seems to have reached a nadir in Oklahoma." C. Hallowell Duell of the publishing company Duell, Stone & Pierce said that as a patriotic publisher of books, "I wish to enter my strong protest against any law in any state of this nation which makes the mere possession of any book a criminal offense. Charles Kerr of the Atlantic Monthly Press said, "I speak for myself and my associates. The day that such prosecutions honestly represent the will of the people, that day we abandon the principles of democracy which have made this country great." While the pressure brought to bear on official Oklahoma to reverse the convictions in the book trials, external forces may have been equally as influential. On June 22nd, Hitler attacked the Soviet Union, and in succeeding months, the Roosevelt administration began a campaign to assist Stalin in his war efforts. When the United States entered the war in December, the Soviet Union became an ally. Because winning the war in Europe seemed more important than fighting communists at home by interpreting criminal syndicalism laws to forbid the sale and distribution of certain types of literature, the cases became less compelling in the eyes of official Oklahoma. In February 1943, the Oklahoma Criminal Court of Appeals overturned the convictions of Eli Jaffe, Alan Shaw, and Ina Wood. You can see them raising the appeal there. In September 1943, it overturned the conviction of Robert Wood. Eli and Bob enlisted in the Army and served their country abroad. Ina stayed back and worked in the defense industry. Alan was told he couldn't serve for unexplained physical reasons. Somehow, the story of Books on Trial got lost in the pages of history, but it has relevance to circumstances we face today. In the early 1940s, official Oklahoma worried so about perceived subversives and suspected terrorists functioning in their midst that they willingly trampled on the civil liberties of several of their own citizens, who primarily were interested in disseminating information, not revolution. In part, the state government was stopped by a nation's reaction. In the early part of the 21st century, we see an American government so concerned about threats from perceived subversives and suspected terrorists who might be functioning in its midst that officials seem similarly willing to sacrifice civil liberties out of an exaggerated need for security. Like the Oklahoma criminal syndicalism law, which still remains on the books and can be invoked any time official Oklahoma chooses, federal legislation and practices, all justified in the interest of national security, poses threats to booksellers and book distributors today, despite the promises from attorneys general that the federal government would never carry its power to such extremes. Books on Trial may provide some historical perspective to question that promise. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Wayne. Great story from history, a story for today as well. So I'm going to ask both Bill and Matthew to please come up here. We're going to take just a couple of minutes here together to get one of the most important missing voices tonight, and that's your voice. So we're going to have a brief period of Q&A, and because the acoustics are so horrible in this room, I'm going to ask Anna if she'll go around and take the microphone to anybody who wants to ask a question.
Hi. So I guess my question is, what would you say is the biggest problem that we as a society face in modern day censorship and losing our voice in present day?
I don't know that there is a biggest problem. There are a series of problems, and they're both internally generated and externally superimposed upon us. I'm not sure I'm going to go beyond that. I speak a lot for American public libraries, and there are a series of traditions and practices that have been carried from the 20th century forward that put obstacles in the way of freedom of expression. Example, if you check the current inventory of children's literature in the year 2015, Charlotte is in the room, maybe she can tell us about this. If you check that, the pages of those books, you will find African Americans to this day vastly underrepresented. So that's internal. External, West Bend, Wisconsin didn't like Harry Potter, and the war still goes on.
I could give a much narrower answer. I was thinking, as I was preparing my talk, just that, I'm describing a problem on the Russian or Soviet, post-Soviet side, but a lot of what I was describing really characterizes Western research on that period when I talk about not knowing any literature from the 30s, 40s, and 50s, studying the works that were produced. I think that Western scholars have shared this bias to only reading works that were banned. And so my answer to the question would be probably the biggest danger is always ourselves, that we create in the narrowness of our perspectives. And that's the right answer to that question. That's one answer to it.
The only thing that I would contribute is follow up with Dr. Wiegand, a friend who's a book illustrator, a children's book illustrator, was given a contract from a major publisher, I forget which one, about how to represent children in American classroom, and it was explicit that Caucasian kids should be represented, or prominently. This was about 10 years ago. I know that has changed a lot, but it's still, it's not gone.
And this is not directly related to burning books or prohibiting them or arresting people, but it occurs to me that a lot of the problems that would affect libraries and censorship comes out of the mass media that we have, that at least as long as I can remember having read them, going all the way back to Vietnam, presents a highly, in my judgment, highly distorted view of the way the world is and how we, United States, fits into that world, which can reflect, I suppose, on books. I read recently a review of a book that demonstrated conclusively that the United States was the one that wanted to separate Germany after the Second World War, not the Soviet Union. And yet the common belief is that the Soviet Union was the entity that wanted to do it and succeeded in doing it. And there were no reviews of the book that demonstrated conclusively that it was the United States. And tons of reviews, very favorable reviews, of books that came out after that one that didn't even refer to it.
I can speak to you because I sense you're over 39 and will remember something called the Reader's Guide to Periodical Literature. Okay, I don't think until the 1970s that Reader's Guide to Periodical Literature had an African American periodical to be indexed in. Now, let's see. Peter went to the Lima Public Library in the 1950s and 60s. If he wanted articles on African Americans, he had to go through the white periodicals that were being indexed in Reader's Guide to Periodical Literature. Second example. Before coming out here, I was in the Cornell Center of the San Francisco Public Library, which is dedicated to preserving the archival gate of late gay and lesbian people. And they have their paperback collection from the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s that the lesbian gay community refers to as survival literature. And there were novels that invited people recognizing their sexuality to think that they were okay. You will not find any of these novels reviewed in the reviewing media that librarians rely upon for acquisitions to this day. So you can see how the practices of a particular profession, I don't want to pick on librarians, it's just that I know that profession best of all. The practices of a particular profession filtering what becomes available in the Lima Public Library in 1963.
Thank you. Is there a way to safeguard against the sort of the revision of history a la George Orwell's 1984 in the fashion that they would sort of rewrite history? Is there something in our system of literature and sort of history library works to protect us or the future generation from being the victims of this revision of history?
Well, that's a really good question. I'm going to teach a course on Russian media next fall, and the sad thing about my story is that the Soviet Union was notorious for its practices in this regard. Post-Soviet Russia has only gotten worse. We have cases now where there clear, deliberate use of slippages in modern media, the advisability of images, information to even more grossly distort facts. Some of you probably heard about the assassination over the weekend in Moscow of the most prominent opposition leader, and Putin personally taking charge of the investigation. And I think we're at a point now where it's just, it almost feels impossible to know constructed a very challenging environment in terms of just the preservation of some semblance of truthful representation of our experience. I think that we're going to have to learn some new methods, some sort of, we have been talking about this, we have websites now that need to be changed. We need to do some archiving of various iterations of sites. And scholars will one day need to go back just the way that we're looking at these different iterations of these books and compare the versions of information that appear at various intervals. But it's getting to be a more complex problem.
I'll take that one on. A problem I see, well, first of all, I'm a humanist working in a profession largely of social scientists who want their information delivered in 25-page articles with bullet points. I can't explain the complexities of the history that they've inherited in 25 pages with bullet points. I need books to do that. I think there are enough people like me that will sustain markets for books so that publishers will continue to publish. Whether they're in e-form or print form, it's irrelevant to me. I'm now learning that the people who cite my stuff have read the e-form more than they've read the print form. Fine with me. Cite the stuff, that's what I'm at. But I do have a fear of the current pressure in higher education towards the STEM disciplines. I fear that. I come out of the state of Oklahoma where the current political environment is to look past the humanities and many of the social sciences to privilege the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. I don't disparage that attention to those, but if without adding that the arts and the humanities, without adding that to the equation, we tend to lose the prospect of fighting against the kind of revisionist history that doesn't serve the why questions. So that I think it's going to happen. I think there will always be people like you and people on the panel here who are going to be asking questions about the status quo that they've inherited. And books will help them provide that. So I think the market's there. But we have to push back.
I have a response, or somewhat of a response, I guess. In Holocaust scholarship, there are some people who believed, mostly through the 60s, 70s, and 80s, that the only voices that mattered were first-person primary witnesses. That we had, and some people refer to them as the keepers or the guardians. And as this population has become more and more conscious through the 90s and aughts, as this population continues to dwindle, that without their voices, what can we rely on? So within Holocaust scholarship, there's a very interesting sort of sense of this historiography and how we can gauge the relationship between primary, secondary witnesses, primary, secondary, tertiary generations. I just know that within that discipline, there's some of these conversations about how we can preserve this stuff in the face of, there's a lot of revisionist history that, discounts the Holocaust. So that's being addressed by that small community of scholars. Waiting for my students to ask questions.
It seems that all these book burnings, these book trials were attempts to stop ideas that were perceived as very dangerous and very powerful. And looking at today's current event, but particularly religious extremism and ideas that may be seen as dangerous or powerful, is there a way to successfully combat an idea, or is it too abstract to actually non-violently combat? Obviously, we see that book burnings do not really put an end to the growth of ideas, but is there a way to successfully do that?
I think the media is the curse and the blessing. I mean, the way that social media was used in the Arab Spring did a lot of good, but also the way the media gets used can close down a lot of the same opportunities. So again, you know, dare I follow Martin Heidegger here, but technology is just a way, it's just a means of getting things done. It can be used in many different ways. So I think as much as we invest in one side, we have to be very sensitive to the other.
I think that probably the consensus here on the panel would be that circulation of information is better than prohibition. And even ideas that we want to censor, prohibit, forbid, we should allow them to be expressed. We should answer as we feel appropriate. I think that open discussion is going to be more productive than any kind of limit. But I mean, the Soviet Union is a classic example of taking the other approach. They believe that that approach was very productive, and I think we're in a world where all societies are taking similar approaches, trying to sort of cut off that dialogue. And we may be in a kind of information Cold War in terms of opening up that dialogue to the kinds of parties that you're, I think, referring to in the question.
Constant vigilance. Constant vigilance. If history is any teacher here, it's constant vigilance. And to bring your point back home, I recommend to your reading James Rison's Pay Any Price. Rison is a former New York Times correspondent who has been followed by the Department of Justice, be it under George W. Bush or Barack Obama, for revealing secrets that tell us something about what our government has been doing abroad. James Rison, Pay Any Price.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, everybody, for coming out tonight. If you were a little reluctant to grab a microphone and have your voice booming here, but still have a question, please feel free to come up and talk to our panelists. Also remember that if you picked up one of their books and would like them to sign it, I think they'd be happy to do that. And most importantly, as we finish now, come up and get one of the free books here. And if you smile real nice at one of them, they might even agree to sign it as Karl Marx or Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Thank you so much for coming out with us tonight, and please join me in thanking Wiegand, William Nickell, and Matthew Girson. Thanks, everyone.